Karma Choephel so salam jaya shela nganye nyame so so nam lo shen lo gom je kang ba so ba shin se no ge na chang je me ba tam Sende de ta chöbe gom shena nye go shenpa me je lo mo Gomje go so ba shin nang de je la ma la je so de go ma je me lo yeng me gong je mo so ba shin ga zha to be mo so ma te ma je de ga jo de go che na gon che da je lo nan do che so ba shin ji ma ji cha la ma cha go che ma go de do je o ko de Change Anyo Sho Dorje Change Gong Anyo Sho. Please turn to your mandala offering pages in the books, or is it teaching practice? I can't remember what your tab says. Mandala offerings. Cha Tse Wa Dan Che Jin Sha Ba Dan Je Zu Yi Ran Gu Shing Su Wa Yi Ge Wa Chung Ze Da Gi Chi Sa Pa Tam Je Da Gi Chan Zhu Chi Ho Sa Ji Pu Zhu Zhu Shi Me To Cham Ri Ra Lin Ji Ni De Jen Ba De Sang Ge Xing De Mi De Pu Wa Yi Ge Nam Da Jing La Je Bra Sho Sem Je Nam Gi Sam Ba Ta Lo Yi Che Ra Ji Da Wa Che Jun Tu Mon Te Pai Che Gi Ko Lo Ko Do Zo. Let's see. Well, let me just get myself organized here. All right. So, first of all, the Dharma expense palace of Akanishta is the essence of all Buddhas of the three times who shows me directly my mind is Dharmakaya. I prostrate to the glorious exalted gurus. Please bless me and all sentient beings that our minds become the Dharma. Please bless us that the Dharma become the path. Please bless us that the path dispel confusion. Please bless us that confusion arise as wisdom. And now please think to yourselves that we are listening to the Dharma this evening in order to bring ourselves and all sentient beings to the state of complete and lasting happiness. That's the state of Buddhahood, the only state of happiness that never wanes, never diminishes, never changes, just lasting happiness, the lasting happiness of being completely free of anything that obscures and having developed all of the qualities. And so in order to achieve that state, we have to listen to Dharma teachings, we have to contemplate what we've heard, and then we need to meditate on what we have in order to achieve the state of Buddhahood. So this evening, what we're engaging in is listening to the Dharma, teaching and listening to the Dharma. And when we teach and listen to the Dharma, it's important that we do this with as good a motivation as possible. So please listen with, if possible, the best motivation, the motivation of bodhicitta, the wish to bring all sentient beings to Buddhahood. And if this is, sometimes this is hard, actually. So if not, please listen with as good a motivation as you can. I think in a sense, this is where it ties into our talk last night. We had a public talk last night. It wasn't broadcast over Zoom. We spoke about loving kindness and loving kindness primarily. And so this is what it is. It's the loving kindness of wanting to bring all sentient beings all sentient beings to the state of completely perfect happiness, completely perfect Buddhahood. So that's why we engage in study like this tonight. But our topic is a little bit different than what we were speaking about last night. And so we've been, as Steve mentioned, we've been going through the Way of the Bodhisattva by Shantideva for quite a few years now. We had we had 1 year that we've missed because of the epidemic, 1 year that we did on Zoom. And then this year in May, I set aside 2 weekends because it's a long chapter to come and do. And as many of you know, I taught 3 sessions, and I got to like the 30th or 31st verse, something like that, which is, by the way, exactly the same place. When I tried to teach this chapter in Hong Kong, I got to the 30th or 31st verse, and then there were riots. They closed down the subways, and like it was in October of 2019, like the worst time in Hong Kong. And so, of course, I was unable to teach the class because not only was no students able to go to the teaching itself, I was not able to get to the teaching. So, and then to get to that same point this spring and then promptly get sick and spend 6 days on my back with a fever, thinking, is the world trying to tell me something? But I got better enough to teach a couple more sessions, one over Zoom and one live. So after that, it seemed to me important not to let this slip, not to let us wait for another year. I mean, 4 months has been long enough to go because it's like, I'm trying to remember exactly what did I say. I don't really remember exactly what I said. Trungpa Rinpoche would have remembered exactly what he'd said, but I'm not like him, unfortunately. I'd like to be, but I'm not. He would have remembered everything that he said, and he would have just picked right up. But I don't remember everything that I said. So I think partially for that reason, also partially because there's some people here who weren't present with us when we did the sessions in May. There's some new faces. So I think it's good to kind of go back a little bit and go over the main points of the first part of the chapter. Just otherwise, it's going to be hard and we're going to get lost. And some of you might also be pretty new. Some of you are new faces to me. And so for that reason, I think it's also good to just kind of take a step back and go briefly over the first part of this chapter, go briefly over the work. So the Way of the Bodhisattva was written by Shantideva, who was a great master, 8th century master in India, but no one knew it. He was at the great monastic university of Nalanda, which was like the premier, it's like the Harvard. It was the first really big university, perhaps in the world. And he got there and he had actually already pretty much figured everything out. He'd already done his listening, contemplating, and meditation. He had visions of the Bodhisattva Manjushri, who's the embodiment of Prajna, or wisdom. And he had basically figured everything out. So when he got to Nalanda, he was there, but he wasn't doing anything. He didn't seem to meditate. He didn't seem to study. And everyone else at Nalanda thought this was just scandalous because when you're there, you're supposed to, listen and listen, contemplate, and meditate, engage in Buddhist activity. And here he wasn't doing anything. So they nicknamed him Pusuku. Pu means to eat. It's from the Sanskrit bhojan, to eat. Su is from the word sonar supta, to sleep. Ku means to poop. So they called him eat, sleep, poop, because that's all they thought he did. And they set up they decided they wanted to get, they were so embarrassed about having there, they decided that the best way to get him out would be to embarrass him totally. So they set up a huge throne and said, it's your turn to teach. And he said, fine. And the huge, everyone heard Busuku is going to give a teaching today. So like thousands, they say 100,000 people. Sometimes large figures are figurative. And there was a large crowd of people gathered to hear him teach. He walked over towards the throne, and then he suddenly was on top of the throne, and no one knew no one saw him climb onto the throne. He just was suddenly on top of the throne. He said, would you like to teach something you've heard before, or shall I teach something new? Which surprised him. So they said, well, let's hear something new. And then he recited the way of the Bodhisattva from the beginning to the end. He had either, some sources say that he had already written it and was just reciting it from memory. Some sources say that he actually composed it spontaneously as he was sitting on the throne. So in either case, he recited it, and then everyone realized what a great being he was. So when we look at this text, the beginning of the text is really about how do you develop bodhicitta, how do you rouse bodhicitta, how do you take the bodhisattva vow, how do you practice bodhicitta, how do you prevent it from weakening, how do you increase it, and then and so that's really what the topic of the text is. And so what we're in the topic now is the topic of the 9th chapter is Prajna. So Prajna means, basically it means discernment. It means knowing what is and what is not. Just being able to distinguish the actual from the fake, and really to be able to see the nature. It comes on many different levels, actually. There's kind of ordinary discernment that we all have, that everyone have. In fact, there's a level of discernment with every single cognition you have, a little bit of prajna with every single cognition. And then as it gets stronger, it becomes what we call transcendent prajna, which means when you're able to actually see the true nature of phenomena, to distinguish what really is from what's not. And so that's the topic of this chapter. And as Shantideva says, like everything that comes up into this, the taking the bodhisattva vow, going through all the teachings on generosity, discipline, patience, diligence, and meditation or dhyana, is really for the sake of what is this? Is really for the sake of developing prajna, as it says at the very beginning of the chapter. It says, the sage taught all these preparations for the sake of prajna. So those who wish to pacify suffering should develop prajna. So prajna, again, means the ability to discern what is from what is not, the ability to distinguish between the two. And so here we're talking about it on the most profound level of distinguishing what is the actual nature of things. And the reason why we want to do this is not just so we can, just for the sake of prajna. The reason why you want to develop prajna is because we want to overcome suffering. We want to overcome our own suffering. We want to overcome other beings' suffering. And so it's important to keep this in mind as we read, listen, think about this chapter, because it's a little bit more difficult, because it's probably topics that many of you are not very familiar with. Some of you might have studied a bit, some of you might be brand new. And so it is kind of philosophical. It can be kind of difficult. But if you remember this really important point, we are not doing this just to do philosophy. We are not doing it to write academic papers. We are not doing it to become learned and known for being learned. We are doing it because we want to stop suffering, our own suffering and other people's suffering. The reason why we suffer, we and all other sentient beings suffer, is that we do not know how things are. And because we are ignorant of the nature of things, we want to do things to make ourselves happy. We think that it comes from somewhere else. And so we try to get things that seem desirable to make ourselves happy. And in chasing after the things that make ourselves happy, then we end up creating more suffering for ourselves and for other beings. And it's not just us. It's not something we should beat ourselves up for and say that we're defective. It is what all sentient beings do. So it's important to remember when we're talking about suffering, about prajna, and we talk about the philosophical topics that come here, there's a reason why we're talking about them. It is to overcome our suffering. So when you listen to this, and some of this is probably, this is not the sort of teaching that you generally get in like a Dharma center where you go over things once a week. It's hard to get these teachings, and it's sometimes more difficult to get into it. But you should not be discouraged if you don't understand it right away. You should remember that the reason for this, what is the reason? It's because we don't want to suffer. We don't want other beings to suffer. And so we have to think about the nature of our experience, the nature of our lives, the nature of everything, in order to be able to overcome our own ignorance, greed, hatred, our misconceptions of how the world are, that in the end create suffering for ourselves and others. So that's why we are doing this chapter. And so what we're really trying to distinguish is the actual nature of things from how they appear to us. And these are what we call the ultimate and the relative truth. And so the beginning of the chapter starts about talking about these two truths. The relative and ultimate are stated to be the two truths. The relative truth means how things appear to us. How things like causes and effects come together to create appearances. We all see each other. We either are seeing a room and people sitting in the room, or you might be looking at a computer screen. Either of these comes because of causes and conditions. And there's the appearance of things. And you look at it and you might say, oh, that's Khenpo David. This is a table. That is a shrine. You might think you are yourself, you have your own name, you call yourself by your name. And so we have these ideas of ourself and others. And and our minds go out to these ideas of the images that we see. But these images are actually, in a sense, projections, because we're not really seeing things as they are. We're a little bit ignorant. So that's the relative world. It's like useful fictions about how things work. It works in daily life. You can walk into a coffee shop and buy yourself a cup of coffee, because we all have conventions about how things work in daily life, but that is not how things actually are. It's not the actual nature of things. We grasp at things as being kind of permanent and stable, real. And because we think of that, then when things change, when they're not what we think they are, then we get disappointed, we experience suffering. So these are the two truths. The ultimate truth is the actual nature of how things, the lack of anything that is permanent, stable, autonomous, or enduring. So we think that things are this way, but they actually are in their nature. They're not. There's this constantly shifting set of causes and conditions that produces the experiences we have. They are not something solid. They're constantly changing, but we do not recognize that. And so we need to recognize that. So the ultimate truth is not something we can conceive of, because it's not the sphere of mind. It's said that mind is relative. So anything we see with our senses in the relative terms, anything we can conceive with our intellectual mind, these are all relative truth. They're like fictions. They're not actually true. They're like fictions. They have a certain amount of truth in terms of dealing with other people who are wandering around in relative truth, but actually they're not what they seem to be. So what we want to do is understand the ultimate truth. That's why we're studying this chapter. But studying the ultimate truth takes, it goes in stages. Basically, you have people who are learning to study that, the yogis, and then you have ordinary people who haven't really learned it. So as it says in the third verse, with those two types of people are seen the yogic and the ordinary. Of these two, ordinary people are confuted by the yogic. So in other words, the yogic know better what the nature of reality is, and so they are able to tell the ordinary people, hey, the way that you're not seeing things, the way you're seeing things is not how it actually is. And because they have a better idea, they're able to, when they have discussions or debates, they're able to prove. Now, the ordinary people may or may not be able to accept what they're hearing, but the yogic people are able to have a deeper understanding. But this goes in stages. You don't get Buddhahood in one step. You go through different stages of listening, contemplating, meditating, developing some realization, and then the realization gets stronger and stronger as you continue along the path. And so in this way, due to distinctions of intellect, higher yogis confute the lower by analogies that both accept but left unexamined for the result. So when the yogis talk to each other, debate with each other, when they debate with ordinary people, they use the language that we all have of the relative in order to show that the relative actually does not work on the way that we think it does. It's not how we think it actually is. So the real difference is that ordinary people, as worldly people, think that things are real just as they are perceived and not illusory. The yogis dispute the worldly over this. So we think that the things we're experiencing in our lives are real, that they're things that will help us, that we therefore want, or things that will harm us and that we therefore do not want. And so therefore we engage in actions out of desire or attachment, or out of aversion, hatred, and anger to push things away. And that creates suffering for ourselves. So this is the basic problem. And in order to be able to overcome it, we need to study what the actual nature of things are. So this is the basic topic of the chapter. In a sense, those 5 stanzas teach pretty much the whole thing about the chapter, the basic thing. But there's a lot more, because you have to understand, because it's hard for us to overcome our clinging to things as being real. The point is that ultimately everything is like an illusion that comes that appears because of causes and conditions, but does not have any real substance to it. But it seems to us in relative life as if it does have real substance, whether it's an enduring substance or whether it is something that sticks around for just a little while. Whatever it seems, or we think there's something real. We think that we are real. We think that the things we use and enjoy are real, or the things that are perhaps threatening to us are real. And because of that, we experience suffering, that we perform actions that that lead to suffering. So this is the problem that comes up in the chapter. So when we are the basic problem that we have is that, and I have to flip forward a little bit in my presentation. Sorry about this. As I look at that, I can't think about 2 things at once. Oh, yeah. Getting there. All right. So the basic problem is that the actual nature of how things are is that they are what we call emptiness. So this is a Buddhist term that is easily misunderstood. It's commonly used, but it's easily misunderstood. It's hard to figure out. It's hard to know exactly what it means. So the important point to say here is that emptiness does not mean nothingness. It doesn't mean nothing. So when we see an appearance, for example, we'll actually be getting into this quite a bit in the next, I don't need to go through it too much right now because it's the topic of tonight's talk, and tomorrow's talk is about exactly how are things not real. But the point is that things are not real. They come together because of causes and conditions. They appear to us. We attach them as real. So we need to meditate on emptiness, the fact that things do not exist as they appear to us. You cannot say that they exist, but they still appear to us. And this fact that things appear but are empty, and empty of what? They're empty of themselves, they're empty of any existence, they're empty of any truth, any reality. When you examine them, there's nothing that you can actually find. And we'll go through the logics about that tonight and tomorrow, so I'm not going to go through it too much right now. At the same time as they're empty, in other words, you can't find, when you examine them, you cannot find anything that really is that thing. They still appear. So they're not nothing, but they're not something, and they're not nothing. They're not existent, they're not non-existent. And they aren't both existent and non-existent, or both something and nothing, and they're not neither. You can't identify them as being anything or not being anything. In the end, it's basically, you just cannot identify what the actual nature is. That's what we mean by emptiness. When you really examine things carefully, you cannot find anything real, enduring, autonomous about it. It's all causes and conditions that create an appearance. That appearance is not separate from its own empty nature. That empty nature is not separate, cannot be found anywhere than in the appearances. So the 2 truths, the relative of the appearances and the ultimate nature of the emptiness are the same. So this seems, but when you say that everything is illusory, everything is just a mere appearance without any reality, this can be kind of frightening to people, because the implications are that, well, therefore, you don't really exist. And nothing really exists. And you might wonder, how is it that things can appear if nothing really exists? And so a lot of other schools of Buddhism, other than this particular school, the middle way school that we're talking about in this chapter, a lot of the schools say that there is something that really exists. A lot of non-Buddhist schools say that there are things that really exist. And so the point of this chapter is to kind of debate with all these other schools and say, this is why it doesn't really exist. Now, what's the reason why we are doing this? The reason is to free ourselves of suffering. And so because the main point here is to free ourselves of suffering. Oh, hang on a second. I'm getting ahead of myself technically. I'm trying to think and do something technical things at the same time. I can't speak and do technical things at the same time. Sorry about that. So back to, yes, that one. So the reason why we are doing this, which may feel a little bit like mental gymnastics to try to think about all these logics, and it may be very unfamiliar, but you have to remember the reason for this is to be able to free ourselves and others from the suffering of samsara. And the result of meditating upon this is to actually gain that ability. So these are the last few, I'm going to go through the last few verses that we discussed in May, starting from verse 52. Freed from extremes of greed and fear to stay in samsara for the sake of those who suffer due to delusion is the result of emptiness. So this is verse 52. So the point of doing this is, again, as I said, it's not some sort of to just do intellectual gymnastics or engage in philosophy for philosophy's sake. The reason is that we need to remove our own delusion about the nature of things so we can then help people who are also deluded, right? So that's the result of meditating on this. There's a point, there's a reason why we are doing this. The refutations of the position of emptiness are not reasonable, so do not harbor any doubts and meditate on emptiness. So this actually passage, we skipped over quite a few verses tonight. I'm sorry about that, but no choice if we're going to get through the rest of the chapter. But basically, there are a lot of doubts that other schools have, saying you don't need to doubt about this, so just meditate on emptiness. The question is, how do you meditate upon that? So it's reasonable to meditate on. The remedy for the darkness of the cognitive and afflictive veils is emptiness. Wouldn't they who want omniscience quickly cultivate it? So cognitive and afflictive veils, these are the obscurations. The cognitive obscurations are the misunderstandings of the basic nature of reality, thinking that there's a real me and that there are real other things and seeing them as separate, dualistic thinking, in other words, not seeing that we're all interdependent and completely connected and that everything is connected. Afflictive veils, or the afflictive obscurations, are the habits of reacting to things with greed, hatred, delusion, doubt, pride, envy, wrong views, and so forth. Those are the afflictive veils. These prevent us from liberating ourselves from samsara, because as long as we have those obscurations in our being, kind of covering up our nature, as long as we have them, we're going to act on them or be in danger of acting on them and then creating suffering for ourselves. So we need to remove all these obscurations, the afflictive veils that prevent us from achieving liberation from suffering, and the cognitive veils that prevent us from achieving omniscience or Buddhahood. So there's nothing to fear about it, actually. It's reasonable to meditate on emptiness, and there's nothing to be afraid of. So if fearfulness is born out of the things that produce suffering, then why is it that emptiness, the cure for suffering, provokes dread? So there's no reason to be afraid of what we're doing, of speaking about emptiness, because this is what actually will free us from suffering. Now, you might be afraid of being confused. And if you're afraid of being confused in our discussion of emptiness, you should feel free to ask questions, of course, and we'll have time for questions. But this is the basic point of the of the chapter is that we need to meditate on emptiness to be able to see, really not just see, but completely realize in full the nature of how things are, so that we will no longer suffer, and then we'll be able to help all other sentient beings free themselves from suffering. So that's the point. So when we look at the nature of, we've got some, someone's not muted. Who is not? Let me get out of here. Okay, now everyone else is muted, so we should be okay now. All right. So let's go back to sharing screen. So now where we are in the chapter, having been through all that, where we are in the chapter, there are 5 main topics in the chapter. The first chapter's topic is the benefits of prajna. That's what we talked about at the very beginning. The second is identifying what prajna is. We kind of skipped that section except for the last 4 verses. And so that means we have now come to the third main section, how to meditate on emptiness. So you talk about, okay, we want to realize the ultimate truth. How do you do it? What do you have to meditate on to realize the ultimate truth? What are the meditations? And the 4th section is refuting clinging to things, or to view things as being real. And the 5th is the results of meditating on emptiness, the benefits that you get from meditating on emptiness. So these are the 5 main topics. So we've been through the first 2. I'm being following this, with a few elaborations. I'm following exactly what Khenpo is using. This is why I have the title of Khenpo. I've learned how to do this. You go through the topics. These are the topics. We are now at the 3rd topic. And the 3rd topic has some subtopics. 2 subtopics. The 2 subtopics are meditating on the selflessness of the individual and meditating on the selflessness of phenomena, right? So we have 2 things. There's the individual, there's us. In other words, selflessness of the individual is examining yourself to see, what am I? Am I something? What am I? Okay. The selflessness of phenomena, meditating on the selflessness of phenomena means looking at other things to see, what are they? Now, these other things might include the things that you think are you, like your body or your mind. Or it might include other objects. So it's like everything kind of inclusive. Because when you think of me, well, when you think of me, what do you think of? You think it must be either your body or mind or something about that. So we first talk about the selflessness of the selflessness of the individual, whether or not there is a me, and if there is, how do we get a me? And meditating on the selflessness of phenomena. So selflessness, or no self, is like one of the main Buddhist ideas. In particular, the idea of the selflessness of the individual, the lack or the no self, anatta in Pali or anatman in Sanskrit, is one of the main Buddhist topics. So that is what we will discuss first. And it has also 5 subtopics: teaching selflessness in general, teaching the Sankhya positions. The Sankhya are a non-Buddhist, ancient non-Buddhist philosophy, very influential in Indian philosophy. We will get to them in a few moments. Refuting the Vaisheshika position. So the Vaisheshika is another non-Buddhist school, kind of a Vedic school. Then the 4th is, even with no self, karma and result is tenable, are tenable. Sorry. Refuting the self of the Mimamsaka and the Buddhist Vatsiputriya school. So this is there are different ideas of self. So in total, we have 5 different sections that are teaching selflessness of the individual. But when it really comes down to it, we're actually talking about 2 different types of self of individual. The first one is what we would call the instinctive clinging to a self. And this means you're actually clinging to yourself as this is like the instinctive sort of, no one has to teach you to do it. Even a little baby, even a mouse, even a mosquito has clinging to itself. They think, this is me. They look at their body or their mind and they say, this is me. No one has to teach you how to do it. There's no complicated idea about it. It's like, this is the basic level of ego clinging that all sentient beings have until they achieve enlightenment, right? This is just instinctive clinging to a self. The second type is the imaginary clinging to a self. So imaginary clinging to a self means clinging to ideas about a self that you are taught. So you are taught that you have a soul. Now that's kind of like saying that you have kind of like a kind of fancy way of explaining the sense of me that you have. You might be taught, or you might either be taught about having a Christian idea of a soul, or you might be taught about having like the Hindu idea of an Atman or soul. In any case, you have this idea about what it is. You might be taught that it is, that the soul or the self is consciousness. You might be taught that it's something other than consciousness. You might be taught that it's that. But in any case, this is something that you're taught. And when you get into a lot of the philosophies, they're like when you go to if you grew up Christian, then you went to Sunday school to learn all about what the soul and all of the complicated things of Christian philosophy are, or the basic things, maybe not the complicated things. If you want to learn the complicated things, you have to go to seminary, right? Or if you study Hinduism or yoga, then you have to learn the ideas of what the soul is. So those are imaginary ideas, things that you were taught by a teacher. Okay, so we've got these two things, the instinctive and the imaginary. And so we're going to deal with the first of these, is the instinctive. We'll deal with that one first. So back to our presentation, back to our list of topics. So teaching selflessness in general is teaching the the lack of teaching that there's no instinctive self, that what we instinctively cling to as me is not really a me. And this again has three different topics. So we're being very Tibetan here. So this part, teaching selflessness in general, has three topics. Teaching that there is no self who is afraid, that the body is not me, and that the mind is not me. So these are the three topics. So the first is teaching that there's no self who is afraid. This is kind of like a transition verse between the last topic, which is talking about the reasons for meditating on emptiness, and the next topic. And in fact, some commentaries explain this not as speaking about selflessness, but as speaking about the previous topic. But I'm following a commentary by Karma Choephel master that teaches that it's part of speaking about selflessness of the individual. So the verse reads, if there existed any me, verse 56, if there existed any me, there could be fear of anything. But since no me exists at all, who is there that could be afraid? So the previous verse, 55, is talking about there's no need to be free of emptiness. What you should be afraid of are the things that can actually harm you. But actually, if something's going to be harmed, if someone's going to harm you, there has to be something that's going to be harmed. And here he's saying, there's nothing that can be harmed. There's no me to be harmed. There's no actual you. And so there's no reason to be afraid of anything. So since no me exists at all, who is there that could be afraid? So this leads to the question about, well, what does this mean? Of course there's a me. So how can you say that there's no me? Well, if you're going to have a me, the me is going to be either your body, the parts of your body, or it is going to be your mind, right? So first, we're going to examine the body. So this first subtopic here, the next subtopic is saying the body is not me. I listed it as topic A. It actually should be topic B. I was doing this too quickly the other day. Sorry. And the text reads in verse 57, teeth and hair and nails aren't me. Bones and blood are not me either. Mucus is not, and phlegm is not, and neither lymph nor pus is me. Fat is not me, sweat is not me, nor are the lungs or liver me. Neither are the other organs. Feces and urine are not me. This is like going through all the different parts of your body and all of the things that are inside your body. Because usually when we think of our body, you only think about the outside, right? We think about the skin. And we think, this is me. But actually, there's all sorts of other stuff inside. And maybe you're kind of aware of it sometimes, and maybe you're not aware of it at other times. But basically, there's nothing. If you look at each of the different parts of the body, your teeth, are your teeth you? right? Is your hair you? No. Your nails are not you. The bones and blood are not you, right? They're your bones and blood. If something is yours, it is not you. Because like you own, you have your watch, you have your fancy watch. I'm embarrassed. You have your fancy watch. Is your fancy watch you? No, it's not, because it is yours. Is my finger me? No. If my finger were cut off, I would still be here, sort of, on a relative level, right? Even on a relative level, if you were, if you have your arms and legs amputated, you are still you on a relative level, right? So those are not you. You can have lots of body parts cut off and still be yourself. I mean, there's a limit, but we won't go there. I'm not going to do experiments. Don't worry. So fat is not me. Now your skin. What is your skin? Your skin is like the skin, like the outside of a bag, and inside it contains all sorts of disgusting stuff: mucus, phlegm, lymph, pus. Fat is not me. Your fat, your sweat. Well, your sweat comes out through your skin. That's definitely not me. You washed off when you shower. Neither are the lungs or liver me. So your internal organs, this includes not just liver and lungs, but also your kidney and any other organ, or also, as to contradict, was it Descartes who said it was what, the pituitary gland? Actually, it wasn't the pituitary gland. He said that there was a little homunculus that lived in the pituitary gland, actually, that was you. That's not an imaginary idea of me. Neither are the or other organs. Feces and urine are not me. You wouldn't want to be feces and urine, would you? Right? We don't think of them as me. Muscles and skin and body heat and breath aren't me. So when we're talking about body heat, like the warmth of the body and the breath aren't me. So actually, we're talking about everything liquid, like the lymph and pus and blood, the sweat and so forth. We're thinking about the things that are solid, the bones and the teeth and the muscles and skin. We're thinking about the warm things, the body heat. We're thinking about the breath. Is any of them as you? No. The orifices are not me, or are not me. So the orifices are like your 9 orifices, 9 or 10 orifices. You've got your ears, 2 ears, 2 nostrils, a mouth, and then other orifices that I want to speak about tonight. But there are orifices. Are any of them you? No. So there's not any body part you can look at and say it's you. So that's talking about your body. The orifices are not me. And then this might think, well, the body is not me, but my mind is me. Nor in any way are the 6 consciousnesses either. If you think about it, 6 consciousnesses, I don't know, maybe some of you aren't so familiar. We've got like 5 sensory consciousnesses. You've got your eye sees a form, and so there's an awareness of form. That awareness of form is what we call the eye consciousness. When you see something, is that awareness of the object, is that you? No. Or is it? Actually, you can't just take my word for it. You have to think about it. You have to really examine it. When you hear something, then you have an awareness of a sound, such as the sound of my voice or the sound of cars outside or the sound of wind or whatever. There's awareness of that sound. Is that awareness you? You smell something and you have awareness of the scent. That is what we call nose consciousness. Is that, in Buddhism, we call it nose consciousness. It's awareness of a scent. Is that nose consciousness, is it you? Similarly, when you taste something, you may be tasting your, what should we say? I always think of cha tofu, like the stinky tiny Chinese tofu. It's really good. Or you might think about, mushrooms or whatever. When you're tasting something, or coffee, that's another go-to, coffee or chocolate. When you're tasting coffee or chocolate or cha tofu or whatever you're listening to tasting, is that awareness of the taste, is that you? No. And your body, when you feel something in your body, is that you? Right. So, and then you have the 6 consciousness is the mental consciousness. And I don't want to get too much. These are basically There is a perceptual aspect to it, but we will not go there tonight. But a lot of the sixth conscious is thinking about. When you experience sensory input, you say, this is good, this is bad. When you think about things, when you wonder about what someone's doing, you have thoughts running through your mind. Are those you? If they were you, then now the reason why these consciousnesses can't be a real you is because they all arise and then they cease. You see something, and then that consciousness ceases. When you smell something, that consciousness then ceases. But you keep going. You have a thought, and you may feel like it's like your thought, your particular thought. It's really you, but that thought stops when you think of something else, right? So it's not really you because you're continuing. That thought has stopped. So because the consciousnesses arise and perish, they cannot be like this enduring, autonomous me. There's a me that we think that we have, and we think of ourselves as being long-lasting. We think that we're born and we're the same person till we die, and then afterwards we're going to be the same being, we think. But there's nothing that endures that's actually me. It's all changing constantly. Even with our body, we would obviously say that it's not me, but with our body, all the everything in our body is changing constantly. So much so that it's said like every few years, everything in your body exchanges. It's completely different, completely changes. So none of it can be said to be me because none of it is enduring. Because if you think about what we grasp it as being me, we think that there's a me who is enduring, and we also think that we're in control. But we're not really in control of our bodies because, well, if we were in control of our bodies, we'd never get sick. We'd never die because we don't want to do it. We'd be in control so we could prevent it, but we aren't. We'd never grow old because we don't want to grow old because growing old is horrible. No, I mean, when you get to a certain age, I mean, maybe it doesn't seem so bad before you're of a certain age, but when you get to a certain age, when you get to that certain age, it does. I mean, I'm not there yet, but when I watched my parents or my grandparents or other people who are old and talk with people who are at that point where it's really apparent how difficult it is. It's really hard. None of us want to do it. So if we had control over our bodies, over our minds, we'd never suffer. If we had control over our minds, we'd never do anything stupid, but we do, right? So none of them are me. So this is refuting the instinctive idea of a me, the idea that something about our bodies or our minds is me. But but in addition to that instinctive idea of a me, there's the imaginary idea of me. So the imaginary idea of a me is the idea that there is some sort of soul. So in Christianity, of course, Christians speak about a soul. Shantideva was not in a Christian culture, so he doesn't directly refute the Christian soul. Instead, he refutes the views of a soul or Atman according to three schools, but primarily two. These are the Sankhya school. The Sankhya school is kind of like a predecessor. It's like the predecessor to most of the Indian philosophies. Had a very strong influence on yoga philosophy, very similar to yogic philosophy, and also later on Vedanta and the Advaita school and so forth. So it's a very influential philosophy. And so we speak about that one first, but before we do that, I need to tell you a little bit about the Sankhya philosophy. And the reason why that he speaks about this one is because the Sankhya philosophy says that there is a conscious soul, a soul that is by nature awareness or consciousness, right? This is actually, in some sense, to that extent, it is similar to the Christian idea of a soul, because a Christian soul is also said to be a conscious soul, part of mind. But Shantideva doesn't address that, so I won't speak about it too much either, other than this mentioning that similarity. The other school that he refutes is the Vaisheshika school. And the Vaisheshika school has the position that the soul is not consciousness. So, in other words, you've got basically two different options you've got three different options for the soul. Well, we'll go through a fourth option, but the first is that the soul is either consciousness or it's not conscious, and therefore you could say that it's material. That's the way the Buddhists describe the Vaisheshika position, although it's not entirely a fair description. Or it could be neither of the two. So something else entirely. And so Shantideva talks about all three of these possibilities and refuting the views of primarily the Sankhya school that holds that the self is consciousness, and the Vaisheshika school that holds that it's something else, something material, shall we say, and then the idea that it's something entirely different, which is the view of the Vajraputriya school. We won't get to that tonight. I think tonight we'll probably go through the Sankhya school a little bit. And I wanted to begin by just giving a really brief description of the Sankhya school. And I'm not going to go into much detail at all, but you kind of have to know where they're coming at in order to understand what Shantideva is speaking about when he talks about the Sankhya school. So the Sankhya school is that there are kind of two different real entities. The first is the primal nature, the nature that everything comes out of. In Sanskrit, it's called the Prakriti. So the primal nature. And then you've got the self. In Sanskrit, they call it the Purusha. So which literally means the being or the individual, Purusha. I tend to use the Sanskrit school word for that when I speak about it, because it's hard to translate exactly what they mean into English, and there are many different connotations of the word that are hard to get into English. And also, a lot of people in describing it use the Sanskrit word. People all I don't know why you translate Prakriti and primal nature and then don't translate Purusha into something consistent, but they don't. But there's the primal nature, and there's this. And so the primal nature is kind of made up of the three different qualities of you yoga people are going to be happy: sattva, rajas, and tamas. The three qualities. And these three, when they're in balance, it's just the nature as it is. And when they get out of balance, then they appear as all sorts of different things through a kind of three-step process, the process of buddhi or intellect, kind of discerning things. It's kind of like everything appears. The traditional example is like of a two-sided mirror, but it's actually kind of like you've got a transparent screen that you've got things that are projected from the primal self nature and things that are projected from the self, and they kind of interact on this sort of like screen, and they kind of know each other. And then there's the process of ahankara or egoity, which is like thinking me. And then there's a process of manas, which is kind of thinking about everything. And then all the other elements and so forth all come out of that. So they have in total 25 different types of categories of phenomena. But the main thing we need to know here is that you've got a primal nature that they say appears as everything, and it's known by the Purusha, the self. So you've got a conscious self that knows everything. Now, the Sankhya idea is that when you realize this dichotomy between the nature and the self, and then the primal nature is allowed to then rest back and to come back into balance, then you have liberation. So it's actually a very subtle, a very profound philosophy in many ways. But the Buddhists, of course, being Buddhists, we don't agree with it entirely, because it says that there is a real primal nature and that there's a real self. Okay, so in Buddhists, we're saying that actually there's nothing really real. It's all just like illusion. So to get back to the Sankhya position, one thing you have to understand is that when they say that the self is conscious, that means like every time you hear like a sound or see a form, there is an awareness of that. So it's the self that's aware of it. That self is by nature the awareness. It's by nature the consciousness, and it is permanent. So this is where Shantideva begins his analysis. He speaks about it here. Share. He says, so refuting it. So it's, first of all, he's refuting the permanent cognition of sound. Now, the reason why he starts out with sound is that when the Sankhya list the different types of consciousnesses, they, unlike we Buddhists always start with the eye consciousness, they always start with the ear consciousness and sound. So that's why he starts out looking at sound, because it's the first one in their list, sound. So they say that the soul is conscious, that it is awareness of sound, form, scent, taste, and touch, and so forth. And it's permanent. So therefore, Shantideva says, well, therefore, if it's permanent and it's cognition of sound, then that doesn't work. He says, if the cognition of sound were permanent, sound would be apprehended at all times. When there is nothing to be known, what knows, and why is it described as a cognition? If it is a cognition without knowing, it follows blocks of wood are cognition too. Thus it is certain there is no cognition when there is nothing present to be known. So the Samkhya are saying that the self is awareness. And when you have awareness of sound, that is part of that permanent awareness. Well, if it's permanent, then you'd always hear the sound. You'd always be hearing my voice. Or you'd always be hearing whatever. You'd always be hearing that. If once you hear a sound, if that awareness of the sound is permanent, it could not change, because it wouldn't. If it changes, it is not permanent. It is impermanent because it's changing, right? If sometimes you have awareness of something, and sometimes you don't, that awareness cannot be permanent. Therefore, the Sankhya idea of a soul, of a conscious self, cannot be true because it cannot be permanent. Like when you have, if you hear a sound, and then you don't hear a sound, when there is no sound, you don't have awareness of sound, right? If you go into a sensory deprivation tank and you cannot hear any sounds, is there awareness of sound? Right? There's none. If you go to sleep and you close your eyes and you're in deep sleep, and you cannot see anything, is there any awareness of a form? No. So those awarenesses are impermanent. They're episodic. Sometimes there, sometimes not. They arise because of cause and conditions, and they perish. So when there is nothing to be heard or nothing to be seen, such as when you are in either a state without consciousness, like being unconscious or being in deep sleep or being in a sensory deprivation tank, then you cannot really say that there's a cognition of those sensory things. And if you say that it's still cognition, it's just not knowing anything right now, then, well, if something can not be knowing anything and still be cognition, then anything could be cognition. As Shantideva says, it follows blocks of wood are cognition too. Thus it is certain that there is no cognition when there is nothing present to be known. So in order to have awareness of something, you have to be something to be aware of, right? Right. Can you have awareness of sound when there is no sound? No. Right. So that's what so the self cannot be a permanent cognition, since cognition is always changing. Now, the Sankhya reply to this is that actually there's one awareness, but it sometimes knows sound and it sometimes knows form. And so the text continues, and if that very one knows visual form at that time, what is it? Does it not also hear? If that's because there is no sound nearby, then there is no cognition of it either. How can a nature apprehending sound become the apprehension of a form? So if you say that, well, the ear consciousness changes to an eye consciousness and can therefore see the visual form, if it's still a permanent ear consciousness, how could it change? And if it's awareness of sound, it has to have awareness of sound to still be awareness of sound. If it's changing, it's not permanent. If you say, well, it's awareness of sound, but there's nothing nearby, then it cannot actually be awareness of any sound, because there's none. There's no cognition of sound, so there cannot be awareness of sound. And also, if it's permanent, if it's a true, real, enduring nature of awareness of sound, it cannot change from being awareness of sound to being awareness of form, because these two are different. One arises because of the eye and visual stimuli. One arises because of the ear and audio, what would you say, audio stimuli, the sounds, right? So they're different. They come up, they arise in different ways. They're different consciousnesses. And so therefore, one can't just go back, and it just can't become another. So did I miss something there? Sorry. Oh, sorry. So they might say, well, it's kind of like you have a parent and a child, the cognition of sound, the self is when it's seeing visual form, then it's awareness of the form. When it's hearing sound, then it's an awareness of the sound. It's interdependence on what it's hearing, they say. But Shantideva says that this isn't true. It's actually can't be quite like that, because it's different than a parent. Excuse me. And then they say that it's kind of like the analogy of a parent and a child. Sometimes you might be thought of like the child of one person, like I'm Charles Fuqua's son. I'm not a good example because I don't have a child to compare myself to. Okay, you have Fred, Donald, and Donald Jr. Donald is a child in comparison to Fred, and Donald is a parent in relation to Donald Jr., right? So he can be both a parent and a child, and so they say it's kind of the same way, that in relation to sound, the consciousness is an awareness of sound. In relation to form, it's an awareness of form. But those are not, when you talk about the analogy, the Donald being the child of Fred is, there's not something real about that. It's not like that. That doesn't, him being a child doesn't mean that that's an actuality, that is a child in relation to everyone. He's only a child in relation to Fred. He's not a child in relation to Donald Jr., and he's not a child in relation to Ivanka or Ivana, or even Marla, right? So there's nothing real about him. It's just like in relation to Fred, he is called a child. In relation to Donald Jr., he's called a parent, but there's nothing real that makes him one or the other. So in the same way, the sattva, rajas, and tamas are not a child and not a parent either. So in other words, in relation to the three natures, the parts of the primal nature that appear as sound, that sometimes appear as sound and sometimes appear as form, there's nothing real about the self that is a cognition of sound of that one manifestation of the primal nature, or a cognition of form of another manifestation of primal nature. So it is not perceived to be a nature possessing apprehension of a sound. So there's nothing real about it. In relation to one thing, you call it by one name. In relation to another, you call it by another, but that doesn't make it real. We could make up words for our relations between different people and call ourselves by those words, but it wouldn't mean anything other than just being a word or an idea if we're calling it independence upon each other. So there's nothing real. We're not, so like with Donald being the son of Fred and the father of Donald Jr., we are not refuting that in relative terms, he appears to be the child, that you can use these words, but we're saying that there's nothing real about Donald that makes him inherently a child. Or that there's anything real about him that makes him apparently, inherently a parent. It's just in relation to different things, and so therefore it's changing. It's like a fiction. So the other argument of the Sankhya school is refuting that there is a truly permanent singular. The idea is that the soul, the Purusha, the soul, is a permanent and singular thing that can function in different ways. And so they make the analogy that actually the Purusha is like an actor. In the matinee, the actor plays Othello. And then in the, what do you call the afternoon show? In the evening, the actor plays King Lear, right? This is kind of a boring analogy. So you've got Othello, one he's Othello and one he's King Lear, or maybe he's, or maybe she or whoever, maybe she's Othello and King Lear, it doesn't matter. They appear in different ways, but there's nothing real. They're acting. There's not actually anything real. And just so they say it's like, so just as an actor can be Othello in the morning and King Lear in the evening, in the same way, the Purusha can be awareness of of sound at one point and awareness of form at another. It changes, but it's actually the same thing. And so Shantideva's reply is that if, like an actor, that itself is seen in different ways, then it's not permanent. So if it's changing from Othello to King Lear, then there's a costume change. And, there's been a lunch probably and a bit of time in between. They're changing. And then they put on a different costume and they appear as King Lear. And so in one, there is, so it's a different manifestation. So it's permanent. It's changed. It's not permanent. It's not. You can't really say that. And if you say that these different appearances are actually one, then you can't say that, as Shantideva says. And if the different manners are just that, if they're just the Purusha appearing in different ways, then then to say that it's one is unprecedented. It's because he wouldn't say that King Lear and Othello are the same. Or you could say, like King Lear and RuPaul's Drag Show or something like that. I don't know, whatever it's going to be. It's because it's different. You can't say it's the same thing. So the different manners are not real and true. They're just so, and the Purusha that is appearing in this way is changing and impermanent. So it cannot be a real, enduring self. But if the different manners are not true, Shantideva continues, do tell me, please, what its own nature is. So the Sankhya response is, well, the way it's appearing isn't true. There's some real thing about it that's real. And Shantideva says, well, say what it is. And then they reply, well, it's just consciousness, you say. And then in that case, it follows that all people would be one. Now, this isn't difficult. You just read it. It's kind of it's hard to see. Why would it follow that all people would be one? Well, what the Samkhya is saying is that the awareness of the sound, awareness of form, awareness of scent are all the same in just being mere awareness. And because they're the same in being mere awareness, therefore they're all one thing. Well, if you say that if everything that's the same in being mere awareness is all one, then everyone's different awareness, everyone's own Purusha. In the Sankhya school, there are individual Purusha for each people. This is a little different than in the yogic philosophy. So in the Sankhya school, each individual has their own Purusha, their own soul. And if that soul, that conscious soul goes from, is all one thing because it's all merely awareness, then everyone else's soul or Purusha is actually conscious awareness. And if one is, and therefore, because they're all just mere awareness, they're all the same, and therefore they're one by the same logic, right? If that actually, oh, I'm getting too technical, sorry. If it doesn't, if it actually followed logically that merely because of being mere consciousness that they're one, then it would follow that all mere consciousness would all just be one. So therefore all beings would be one, which is not a position of the Sankhya school. Not only that, it's not just all being. The sentient and non-sentient would also be one, says, well, since their existence is just the same. You could use the same logic and say that, well, sentient beings, in verse 67, sentient beings, and the non-sentient, the material phenomena, they'd all be the same because they have existence. They merely exist. They're the same in at least existing. The Purusha all exist. The phenomena all exist. And since they're the same and merely existing, therefore they're all one. It's the same logic, which is obviously not logical. when the particulars are also false, what basis is there for similarity? So when you so if this is not true, if everything is, if all the particular things that are perceived are not true, then there's no basis for evaluating similarity between them. So in this way, the Sankhya position of the self cannot be logically true. So this is the refutation of the Sankhya school. And I think that's enough for tonight. We'll move on to the Vaisheshika school. This is kind of difficult material for a number of reasons. The first is that we're not familiar with the different schools. I mean, if for Shantideva speaking to his audience in 7th century in India, especially at a place like Nalanda, everyone would have known. In fact, ordinary people would talk about sattva, rajas, and tamas. They'd speak about the purusha, the prakriti, and the primal nature. They would know it. It'd be kind of part of their culture. But for us, it's not, so that makes it harder. But if you take some time to think about what is the main point, is there something singular and enduring and autonomous that is me, that is yourself, that is in your mind? In your mind, is there? If you can't find anything, then there can't be any self there. So that's kind of looking at the instinctive idea of a self. That's easier for us to look at. And when you have some idea, if someone tells you that there is a permanent or eternal, the Christian idea, it's very interesting. I mean, the Christian idea of a self, you have the idea of a soul that is created and has a beginning. So by the Buddhist perspective, when you talk about that soul, because at the very beginning, it is created by an almighty God of some sort. Therefore, that has to be impermanent and changing. Now, it may be an eternal continuum that goes on forever, that seems to go on forever, but it can't be permanent in the sense of being enduring, singular, and autonomous. It has to therefore depend on causes and conditions, because at the very beginning it had a cause and condition. If it needed a cause and condition for its very first moment, in its second moment it's going to need a cause and condition, and in the third moment, and so forth until the ad infinitum. But even, we'll get to the refutations of a creator God later on, probably, hopefully tomorrow, or actually on Sunday, we'll get to those refutations. But so also this logic does also apply to some degree to the Christian idea of a soul, but it's a little bit different. There are some variations there. So that is enough, but this is complicated material. So if maybe we should have some question and answer now, if anyone has any questions. And I think we'll take some live questions first, or maybe if some of you online have the questions online. And I have to turn my sound up so before you have questions online. Does anyone live in the audience have a question in the live audience? You might have questions tomorrow morning after you think about this. This is a lot. Anyone online have any questions? All right. So maybe if there are no questions, we will then go on to the closing chants. Oh, sorry, I need to get that one. So for our closing chants, we will recite the long life prayer for the Gyalon Karmapa, and then the swift return prayer for Kenshin Tonga Rinpoche. And then we'll recite do you have the 3 verses Keishin Kyo Wadatni Tamjidu in your booklet? Keishin Kyo Wadatni Tamjidu. Okay, so
I'm not sure we still have the verses for the Karma.
Well, we will put them on screen. Will they show up there? Can people see that? Okay. Okay, we're going to rotate the screen to make it. Also, when we recite the Swift Return Prayer for Rinpoche, if you have the photocopy of it, it might be a little bit different. The translation is a little bit different. I edited the translation a bit, so I don't know how recent a photocopy you have. Anyways, we'll begin with this. 오자 근인제라서 karma 작은 드네치드 karma 작은 동서 원고 karma 오르진로 르체네샤덴소 드네남다 주인네와제난도 숨저 유메로갈기 시시용기 참다 놀제 장냐메 샤블라 차ță 听人口为家苏之容瓦雷女出身 bunge te pai nyam tha droku jobe pa o che pa ji je zi la ma te ren no che no ren jen che gi je si Yonze mawe seng tendro de marme num se tar drobe de zewe gonso ke te sambe lu tong rangye shing te sang gombe 유라공德sanche zombe 개양 등보진 마외 생계라yan 유르제소. Oh, sorry about this one. Kaju lam la da pu kaju dandru ju yong le karma kam sangi shetan dru be jun san se jir minyan be ke bun yurjezo so let's start from this page. Omi shine kaju lame tsotugi kangbo chewa tabu jezu lame tuje ranku de trube dasha nyurda charward Palche mahar chanda dandra dunjo tani ponyar chogi toko nima shunwe gan shunde dembe songma nirzuji Lama tsa sun ya tsu den tu tang da ja lo ban de dong se ji be ji tra Sobe Nama Lura Drube Jure George Keshin Kewa Dani Tamje Riksan Losal Ngajal Mebada Ninje Cheshin Lama Lagupe Palde Lame Tamzi Lane Sho Palde Lame Nambra Tarpala kechi tsamnya lota mikeshin jidze lebrar tongwe mugugi lame jinla senla jubar jo kewa kundu yanda lama tandalme Chuji Bala Longzhi Jing Sata Lamji Yunde Rabzo Ne Dorje Changi Gongpang Nyur To Ro. So recite the prayers for rebirth and Sukhavati. Emaho Sanje Navaye Raye Sujo Chembodam Yunde Semba Tujen Tom Nam La Sanje Jansen Pame Koji Gor Deji Ngotsar Badu Me Bayi Dewa Jinshi Jawe Shinkamder Dani Dine Tsebe Jurmata Kewa Shingi Parma Chuparo Tero Jen Nangte Shatong Sho Deke Dagi Manam Taba George Sanje Jansen Tamje Game Rubra Jinji Lando Lo Tarya Panchendriya Avam Bodha Naye Svam Jodja Seje Gong Tsoni Zola Jiram Dagi Dusumge Saba Kunjo Sumla Chibabo Jawe Temba Jurji Gewa Sanjangunamo Rogu Sanje Tom Jurji Geza Tamje Chitude Dagi Jula Minjurji Tribni Dane Tsozote Sere Neme Nyamdo Pel Tsendere Saju Nunjurji Namji Tseb Armata Dewa Jendo Jurji Kene Peme Kachete Luten Deva Sanje Sho Chanchu Tomne Jisido Trube Joden Bajo Sunam De Hanje Ziva Tomne Berana Hanje Kega la chi pa la cho bai si be so le ro ro ro. Thank you very much. So tomorrow morning, you have sitting at 9 a.m. and then the talk will start at 10 a.m. Eastern, 7 a.m. Pacific time. So thank you very much for coming and listening this evening or this afternoon, whichever it may be for you. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Let's see everyone there. Okay. Bye-bye. Take care.